Conmen, the most devious of all criminals. Charming, cool and calculating, they betray trust and devastate lives, yet remain a complete enigma. We are about to explore the mysterious world of these master criminals, giving an unprecedented insight into the workings of the complex minds of some of the world's most cunning con men and women. We will reveal the detail and the intricacies of their elaborate crimes and uncover how they were dramatically brought to justice. In this show, the con man who convinced his community that he was a high-flying barrister.
The reality was that the only time that Stephen Clenshaw had been in a courtroom was actually as the defendant.
However, by posing as a legal eagle in a tight-knit community, Stephen Clenshaw's act made him over an estimated £500,000.
Stephen Clenshaw was living the life of a Premiership football player, but he was doing it at the expense of other people's life savings.
I was conned by someone who I trusted so much, who I put a lot of faith and respect into.
But while Clenshaw devastated the lives of the people who thought that he was their friend and neighbour, one man set about bringing the con man to justice.
I couldn't let this person who was masquerading as the law get away with this. I knew justice had to be done.
In March 2007, after a long day at work, a young woman caught the train home from Birmingham. Aboard the train was also a suave and smart gentleman. The couple struck up what seemed to be an innocent conversation.
The woman discovered that the man in his 30s was in fact Stephen Clenshaw, and he was a barrister.
He was very sharply dressed, very expensive suits, nice haircut, very credible.
She was attracted to him. He was charming, funny and successful.
And most single girls would be flattered and intrigued, wouldn't they, by a well-to-do barrister who approaches them on the train, because that does have a certain romance to it, and we girls, well, we're suckers for romance.
The only problem was that Stephen Clenshaw was lying. He was in reality a seasoned con man. The persona of the charming and successful barrister was utter fiction.
Stephen Clenshaw has very few, if any, qualifications at all. He's certainly never qualified in the legal field, but would always present himself as an experienced barrister.
But the young woman took the debonair stranger at his word.
People as a rule assume that other people are just like them, so if they're trustworthy, if they're honest, they assume the other person is as well. And that's a lovely quality, unless you're talking to somebody like Stephen Clenshaw.
Stephen Clenshaw's patter worked its charm, and the couple started dating. But the lies continued.
He not only told this young lady that he was a barrister working with the BBC, but he also explained to her that he had connections to government security services.
He sold himself to her as this James Bond type lawyer. He whisked her off and wined and dined her, even showed her the MI5 building. It must have been very exciting and even a bit sexy.
The young woman completely fell for her James Bond. She utterly believed Stephen Clenshaw's bogus barrister con, and in October 2007, after a whirlwind romance, the couple moved into a house in Sutton Coldfield in the Midlands.
She helped him choose a 5-bedroomed rented detached house that he paid £7,000 in cash in advance for a 6-month lease.
Typically the neighbourhood, there were doctors, professionals, people from the banking fraternity, one neighbour was a jeweller, property developers, people of long established professional industries.
Stephen Clenshaw was stalking his way into an affluent and exclusive area of Sutton Coldfield, a potentially rich hunting ground for a con man. But his success or failure rested on his transition into the new community. His arrival into the neighbourhood under the guise of a wealthy, content barrister had to be utterly convincing.
It was the type of house that you would expect a barrister to live in, and he spent £40,000 kitting out this rented house within the first few weeks of moving in.
He's flashing the cash, not just to his girlfriend, so to reinforce that he is who he says he is, but also to the wider community. He's sending a very clear message: I'm here, I'm successful, I've arrived, and most importantly, look, I can be trusted.
Stephen Klengshar appeared to be every inch the successful lawyer. To his local community, he had the perfect job, the perfect girlfriend, and the perfect home. Now all he had to do was select his victims or marks and begin the con.
He gave the impression that he was very smooth, very well connected. I work freelance for the BBC, I represent numerous actors.
He very quickly established himself as a very popular figure. A lot of people would enjoy spending time in his company. Fairly generous, would quite often buy rounds of drinks and always offer to help them with any legal problem that they may have.
He's grooming everybody around him. He's positioned himself as this pillar of society, the person to go to when you've got a problem, because he's the man who knows other men who can. He's got all the connections. So that's very clever, when actually your sole aim is to dupe as many people out of as much money as you possibly can.
Seamlessly entrenched and trusted in a close-knit community, Stephen Klengshar's neighbours could not have possibly imagined how low the con man would stoop and the devastation he would wreak by posing as a bogus barrister.
By winning the trust of his entire community, Stephen Klengshar had really set himself up to pull a quite audacious con, where he had set up a whole community of people, and now he could pick off his marks one by one.
In October 2007, a high-flying barrister called Stephen Klengshar and his girlfriend moved into an exclusive area of Sutton Coldfield in the Midlands. But Stephen Klengshar wasn't who he said he was. To his new neighbours, and even to his unsuspecting girlfriend, he had carefully crafted and created the illusion that he was a lawyer. Only he knew the truth. He was actually a con man.
I think it's a very effective game plan to adopt the persona of a barrister, because people trust barristers. They trust people who they see as working every day in a court of justice, an upholder of the law, if you like. People tend to be much more compliant with people that they feel have authority, have positions. So doctor, lawyer, teacher, they're all great personas for a con man.
This is a classic use of the authority effect, which is basically where, by adopting the persona of a figure of authority, that automatically helps you to win the confidence of your marks. And people will trust you with all sorts of things, including large sums of money.
Stephen Klengshar had created the perfect persona to con people, but it was a persona he had developed while behind bars, because the man people in Sutton Coldfield viewed as a high-flying QC had actually conned his friends and neighbours many times before.
While in prison serving a previous sentence, he'd passed his time by reading some law books, which is where he'd gained his knowledge from, and he just expanded on that when in company with people.
That prison sentence was simply the latest in a long line of criminal activity dating back to his teenage years.
Originally, Stephen started out life in the Chesterfield area of Derbyshire, where he grew up with his family. Even then, at quite a young age, he was getting himself into trouble where he was conning money out of people.
So we see already even in his early life, he's deceiving people to make money illegally.
Stephen Klengshar's con man lifestyle saw him first sent to prison in 1995 after conning people with a fake high-yield investment scam. Upon release from prison, the con man married in 2003 and had a child with his wife. However, now with a family to look after, he resorted to supporting them illegally.
This first custodial sentence in 1995 was repeated 10 years later in 2005, where Stephen again found himself imprisoned for fraud.
After Klengshar's second custodial sentence, he and his wife separated. But even the end of his marriage was not a wake-up call for the con man.
I mean, when he was in prison, Klengshar obviously read up on the law, and you know, he may have acquired some smattering of ability or technical expertise. It's a shame he couldn't be bothered to actually knuckle down and study it for real, but that's the con artist's way, is they don't want to do the hard work, they just want to take the shortcut.
Stephen Clenchar hadn't long been out of prison before he met that young woman on the train and moved into the 5-bedroom house in Sutton Coldfield with her.
Stephen Clenchar had laid the foundation for his most ambitious con yet. He had convinced everyone, including his live-in girlfriend, that he was a high-flying barrister.
So Stephen Clenchar's girlfriend is what we might call an inadvertent shill. And the shill is someone who lends an air of authority or trustworthiness to the con artist in the eyes of the mark. Because of the shill seems to be playing along, and it makes the con man look like the real deal. So the shill kind of provides his bona fides. And in this case, his poor girlfriend, he conned her into being a shill effectively.
But his girlfriend would not be Stephen Clenchar's only shill. At the con man's local, the White Horse pub, there was a young man with legitimate legal knowledge. 21-year-old Graham Sprayson had recently graduated from law school, and because his legal career is just beginning, has requested his identity be concealed.
It was the summer of 2007 and I just graduated from Staffordshire University with a law degree. At the time I was working in a restaurant, and obviously that wasn't what I wanted to do as a career. I was hoping to develop myself further. The plan was that I was to go to the College of Law in Birmingham to study the BVC, which is the Bar Vocational course, which would then qualify me as a barrister, and that was hopefully the career, the path that I was leading to go down to.
And one afternoon, Stephen Clenchar, bogus barrister at law, stopped in at the pub after an apparently busy day representing clients.
And he came in one afternoon, must have been like 3 or 4 o'clock, and he was very well dressed in a very smart suit. He looked professional, he sort of had an aura of authority about him. He told me that he was a barrister, and of course, having the aspirations to go and do what said he was doing at the time, that was what I wanted to do, and I got talking to him and we sort of developed a bond from that as such.
And the seemingly successful barrister took the student under his wing.
He sort of rewrote my CV for me to give it a bit more of a professional look. What he said was more of a legal professionality about it to make it stand out in the field that I was hoping to go into. He said he had been in my position before and he knew what I was going through, and we took a friendship from there almost.
In Graham Sprayson, Stephen Clenchar had met someone who could unwittingly help take his con to the next level and begin to dupe his community out of their hard-earned cash.
He told people that he thought it was about time he set up his own law firm, so he decided to temporarily set up one at home, Anderson, Fairbanks & Co.
The 5-bedroomed detached house on the outskirts of Sutton Coldfield that he'd rented for cash, he actually converted the garage of that property into an office.
The bogus barrister had been grooming Graham Sprayson as an inadvertent shill, someone who could make his con even more plausible. Clenchar launched Anderson Fairbanks & Co. in January 2008, and with his bogus law firm up and running, he approached Graham with a seemingly generous offer for a recent graduate.
He gave me a couple of weeks' work experience, which I took off a holiday from the pub, and I worked there, and he said he was impressed with me and would I like to be involved. And of course at that point I sort of bit his hand off because that was almost too good to be true, unfortunately, and that's sort of where my career started with him.
That's really, really good. Yeah. Top man. Cheers. Brilliant.
At this point, Graham Sprayson had no inkling that he was working for a criminal and a con man. He truly believed the man who hired him was a high-flying barrister, and his legal career was off to the start he always dreamed of.
His knowledge was plausible, and he would often quote statutes and sections off the top of his head. There was no need for me to doubt him because he never gave me any false information to go by.
If we're offered a big break and it's something that we're really revved up for, we're really enthusiastic about, then obviously we're not going to stop and look to see whether there's any danger signs. It's very sad, but unfortunately sometimes if something is too good to be true, then it is.
Not only had Stephen employed a law graduate to do research for him, he'd also employed another acquaintance from the public house to be his office manager. Both of these people he would pay around £1,200 a month.
Graham and his colleague started full-time work for Clenchar in February 2008 and had no idea their wages would come out of the pockets of people the con man would deceive by illegitimately posing as a bogus barrister.
He was charging for work which was ultimately useless because it had no legal worth whatsoever.
I worked on wills and divorce proceedings. I produced the documents that Steve could then fill in, because obviously I didn't have the authority in my job title to go ahead and do what Steve was doing.
Stephen would sign the papers as a barrister at law, and whatever the job would be, whether it be a commercial dispute, matrimonial dispute, the money would be paid in cash and go straight into Stephen's pocket.
Clenchar would sign the documents barrister at law, and by doing that he made those legal documents invalid.
Stephen Clenchar was making money with his barrister con, but he was very careful about how and when he would dupe his victims.
One of the safety features that Stephen put in place was that he wouldn't target complete strangers. He would target a circle of people that were already aware of him, aware of his supposed position as a barrister, and their relationship would begin from a position of trust. He didn't have to earn that, it was already there.
Clenchar was actually approaching these people, directly going to acquaintances, colleagues and people who considered him as friends. So that suggests to me that he's really quite psychopathic, because he's lacking in empathy for other people. He's lacking in empathy for the people around him. He really has got no remorse.
Stephen Clenchar was manipulating vulnerable people involved in stressful situations simply to put cash in his pocket. In February 2008, the bogus barrister agreed to represent a young woman, a friend of his own girlfriend, who was filing for divorce.
From one client that was in the throes of an acrimonious divorce, extremely vulnerable and did need legal assistance, he made £3,000 in cash for doing nothing.
So for 2,000, I'll make sure it goes straight to the top of my job list.
Stephen Clenchar had made money from his prey as they paid him for his sham legal services. But Clenchar's con was about to evolve as he offered those who trusted him the opportunity of a lifetime.
What Clenchar did, as well as offering these bogus services, was to start approaching acquaintances and offering them a deal that was too good to miss.
If you meet a charming and successful barrister at a soiree and the conversation just happens to turn around to this investment deal of a lifetime, then why wouldn't you be tempted? Because after all, look at where he is. You know that he did that lady's will. You know that he's here in this big house wearing all of the designer clobber. He's very successfully infiltrated a particular social network, and once he's in there, he's going to wreak havoc.
Several people were now being sucked into Stephen's circle of deceit. He was being handed £1,000 here, £1,000 there. One man that he'd prepared a will for actually went on to give him £11,000 in cash to be invested on his behalf.
Clenchar's con was now reaping substantial rewards, and it seemed that if a person trusted the bogus barrister, then they inevitably were going to be conned. Even those who thought they were his friends and were working tirelessly on his behalf were unaware that their dreams were built on cruel lies. And he didn't stop at conning his employees into thinking they had a real career break. He also cruelly conned them out of their earnings.
I invested over £1,000 into a scheme that he concocted. It was a timeshare scheme where if I gave him £1,000 in the space of 3 or 4 weeks, I'd get £5,000 back. Obviously the sound of it was alluring and everything else about him was believable. I believed the same thing again.
If Clenchar was to approach strangers with this deal of a lifetime, then the chances are that they would run for the hills. But the thing is that he was approaching people who he knew, who liked him, who respected him, who felt that they could trust him and who were aware of his credentials, if you like. So in that way, he was able to achieve the unthinkable.
These people thought they were making a solid investment on the recommendation of a lawyer, a pillar of the community, and they never saw their money again.
The whole community were completely convinced that Clenchar was legitimate and was who he said he was. He was so persuasive that even his girlfriend who lived with him never doubted that he was a fully qualified barrister.
Unfortunately for her, she hadn't yet realised that Stephen had actually started to steal from her. He took £2,000, he used her credit card to fund an extravagant internet gambling habit.
Conmen in many ways represent the worst of human nature. Virtues are abused, strengths are turned to weaknesses, positives are turned to negatives, and ultimately trust is betrayed.
But the victims Clenshaw had betrayed were at some point going to become suspicious. The legal work they had paid for would not be completed, and the investments they had made in good faith would never deliver the return they had been promised. Clenshaw was playing a dangerous game, but it seemed he had a plan that would allow him to extend his con and get away with it.
It did seem as though Stephen had given some thought to his exit strategy from this prolonged con. He'd told people that were close to him that he was terminally ill with cancer.
And the lie rolled off the con man's tongue, despite the fact he was cruelly manipulating people who genuinely cared about him.
At the time, I remember actually it was the Monday morning, I came in and he sat me down and said, "I've got some news for you. Unfortunately, it's bad news." Of course, at the time, I didn't know what to expect. And he came out with that. He said that he had bowel cancer, which, well, obviously being a friend as well as an employee of his, I was completely taken aback by it. I was completely shocked.
Clenshaw was cruelly using the pretense of cancer to stop friends and neighbours chasing up their investments, and the heartless smokescreen worked perfectly.
Naturally, I felt awkward with regards to the money. Obviously, I was promised a return on the money, which never came, but morally, how can you ask a dying man, or what you believe is a dying man, for your money back?
It seemed Stephen Clenshaw was willing to sink to any depths in order to con and dupe clients, friends and colleagues out of their money. But when he turned his attention to his next-door neighbour, his elaborate con began to unravel.
It was 5 to 6 months after Stephen had moved in. Because of his movements during the day, my wife had obviously befriended him, and because of his statements and his reference to clients, business, law, she'd built up a certain amount of trust, thinking that he was somebody that represented the Law Society.
And the neighbours seemed to really hit it off.
My wife's first impression, as I understand, was that he was very chatty, very friendly. It can be a long day when you're a mother at home with young children and nothing but school runs, and sometimes a little bit of pleasant conversation with somebody is just that, a breath of fresh air.
Utterly charmed by Stephen Clenshaw and his barrister persona, Mrs. Clive did not hesitate in hiring his services when her elderly aunts needed legal assistance in February 2008.
They are in their late 80s, all live together. Something they'd requested my wife to do was to seek a solicitor to get a will drafted for them. Obviously this had come up in conversation with Stephen, to which he said, "Well, I can prepare those for them and I will charge them a reasonable fee."
Mrs. Clive and the con man she believed was a barrister visited the aunts, and Clenshaw drew up their wills and put their estates in order, charging them £900 for his sham services. But that money was merely pennies compared to what the aunts had hidden in their home.
They also produced a large amount of cash which they hadn't deposited in the bank. They gave that to my wife for safekeeping. The reason being is that they are virtually housebound. My wife took the money away from the house with the will signed, with the intention of depositing the money on behalf of them.
I just feel so much better if I knew it was in a bank.
On the 11th of February 2008, Mrs. Clive's relatives had handed over a box filled with £46,000 and asked her to take care of it. And as the couple headed home, Stephen Clenshaw saw his opportunity and took it.
Stephen approached my wife to say, "You do realise what we've done is illegal. It is tantamount to theft because we have not given them a receipt for the money." He then explained to my wife that because of his position as a barrister, he was duty-bound to take care of the money as a legal representative of them, and as such he would take the money and register the money.
Now, for somebody like Stephen, that's a heaven-sent opportunity.
Stephen Clenshaw had convinced Mrs. Clive to hand him a box containing £46,000 because she believed that he was a lawyer. But Clenshaw could never have imagined that by conning his next-door neighbour, a chain reaction of events would explode his lies and reveal the truth about the bogus barrister.
He thought he could take away from me and my family. he was thinking that, he can think again. I was going to make it my mission to get justice done.
Stephen Clenshaw had been living with his girlfriend in Sutton Coldfield in the Midlands since October 2007. Although he had no qualifications, in January 2008, the 36-year-old had set up a fake firm called Anderson Fairbanks & Co. and was posing as a barrister, charging people for legal work that was worthless and offering those who trusted him the investment opportunity of a lifetime. It was all bogus, and Clenshaw was conning thousands and thousands of pounds from his victims. In February 2008, Clenshaw had set his sights on his next victim, Mrs. Clive, his next-door neighbour, who had hired him as a lawyer for her elderly aunts.
On the second visit to see my wife's relatives, they also produced a large amount of cash which they hadn't deposited in the bank. They gave that to my wife for safekeeping. My wife was then convinced by Stephen that what she had done was illegal by removing the money from the house without taking a receipt. But because he was a barrister, he was duty-bound by law to accept the money and retain the money for safekeeping until it could be deposited, and because he was covered by the oath of the position that he was in, it would be safe.
Stephen Clenshaw had once again used his fictional persona of a barrister to dupe someone out of money. However, this time he may have gone too far. He had stolen £46,000 from his next-door neighbour.
It's a very risky game that Clenshaw's playing because he actually has to see these people day in and day out. Now, for most of us, if we were ripping off our friends and our neighbours, we would actually be consumed with anxiety about that. We'd be wondering what's going to happen next. But yet he was able just to make excuse after excuse after excuse.
Several days after my wife had given Stephen the money for safe deposit, she had not received any further communication or information from him, bearing in mind he'd been backwards and forward and very familiar, and she attempted on several occasions to contact him to just basically bump into him to get an update, get a receipt for the money, and to see where the money had been lodged or filed.
These were people who knew him, they knew where he lived, and there was always going to come a point where they started questioning where their money had gone and what had happened to the services he was offering them.
Mrs. Clive had handed over £46,000 to a friend she believed was a trustworthy man of the law. However, once the bogus barrister had gained control of the money, he made it impossible for the housewife to contact him. Mrs. Clive was beginning to face the reality that she may have lost her elderly relative's life savings to a con man.
You said you'd get in touch and you haven't. Just as soon as you can, please, it's urgent. Thank you.
After my wife had made numerous attempts to retrieve the money from Stephen, she came to me and told me what had happened. Lots of thoughts go through your mind when you're confronted with a situation like that. I thought the best way forward was to engage the services of a private detective to try and find out if there were any more scenarios, situations, before we could go to the police and present our information to them.
Mark Clive set the private detective to work to ensure he had a concrete case against the calculating con man. But while Mark Clive was setting the wheels in motion to bring the bogus barrister to justice, Stephen Clenshaw made an unexpected preemptive strike against the Clive household.
On the 24th of April 2008, Stephen Clenshaw came into the police station. His initial claim was that he was being blackmailed. There was a vendetta being run against him by his next door neighbour, and he was appealing to the police for help to work on his behalf to try and sort things out for him.
I think this shows us why Stephen Clenshaw is such a successful con man, because he's absolutely relentless. So here he is, the walls are closing in, we know he's guilty, but rather than say, it's a fair cop, governor, I'm going to give you the money back, no, he goes into basic fight or flight and actually goes on the counter-attack.
They're actually saying I've stolen £46,000 in cash from a shoebox they asked me to look after.
Stephen Clenshaw had boldly gone to see DC Rob Hayes, determined to turn the tables and make his innocent next-door neighbours appear to be the villains in a blackmail plot.
He went on to explain to me that on the 11th of February 2008, his neighbour's wife visited him at his home address, and she gave to him a bag containing £45,000 in cash. She asked him to look after this money on her behalf, something he was more than happy to do. She then became concerned that she'd given the money to him, so he wrote out a handwritten receipt for this money and assured her that it would be safe in his keeping. He went on to explain to me that he had returned this money to his neighbour. Unfortunately, he'd failed to get a receipt to demonstrate that that had happened. He was now being threatened by this neighbour to return money that he insisted he'd already given back.
He attacks these people that he's taken money off and tries to make it look as if actually they're the guilty parties. So he's absolutely audacious, only concerned with his own self-preservation. But it shows me just how arrogant this man is. He's obviously got a huge sense of entitlement that he actually thinks he can pull this off.
No mention at this stage of his life as a barrister, portrayed himself as the victim of a terrible blackmail plot where his life was in danger.
So basically I've just come in to see where I lie with this and if there's anything you can do.
But Clenshaw's devious bid to twist the truth and frame his neighbours did not fully convince DC Rob Hayes.
Throughout this entire meeting, Stephen was very pleasant, he was very articulate, he was very persuasive, he appeared to be very genuine, but there was something that wasn't quite right. I wasn't happy. Can't put my finger on why. I just wasn't happy that this was the truth.
After Clenshaw's visit on the 24th of April 2008, DC Rob Hayes began to set about untangling the web of lies Clenshaw had spun. Meanwhile, the private detective Mark Clive had made some interesting discoveries.
They confirmed back to me that he had previous criminal records. He had been in and out of prison for similar offences. He had duped other members of the community in similar kind of ways, profiling them, taking money on false promises, investment opportunities, so on and so forth, and kept moving around the country, county to county, in and out of prison, doing the same operation really.
Meanwhile, DC Rob Hayes needed to speak to Mark Clive regarding the allegations Clenshaw had made about him.
I explained to Mr. Clive that Stephen Clenshaw was claiming to be the victim of a blackmail plot. Mark Clive at this point actually laughed.
I was actually quite pleased because I was aware of what was the truth, and I thought it won't take the police very long to establish who had taken the money from who.
I was also informed during that telephone call that Mark Clive had gone to the trouble and expense of hiring a private detective to look into the background and dealings of Stephen Clenshaw.
I'll make sure that my guy speaks with you. Can I have your name again?
DC Rob Hayes met the private investigator on the 28th of April 2008.
The private investigator was a goldmine of information. He was able to supply the names and the addresses of people that were associated with Clenshaw that would become our second, third and fourth victims of cons run by Clenshaw.
And that list, provided by the private investigator, revealed a victim who had lost everything at the hands of the callous conman.
Over a period of 14 months, Clenshaw had actually duped this man out of £270,000.
The victim was an old acquaintance of Clenshaw and hadn't seen the conman for some time.
A chance meeting at New Street Station re-established their relationship And Stephen used that opportunity to explain what a wonderful investment opportunity he had.
The old acquaintance had no idea he was dealing with a career conman and invested £100,000 in early 2007. But that was not enough for Clenshaw. After the businessman's initial investment, Stephen Clenshaw manipulated him into handing over obscene amounts of money.
Clenshaw cleverly uses a couple of classic con tricks. One of them is something called deadlining, which is where you pressure the mark into parting with money by telling him he's got to act now, time is running out, the investment window is closing, he's going to miss out on the opportunity. And then there's the hurrah, which is where you say to the mark, look, you've already invested X amount, but if you don't give me the extra money, we're going to lose everything, and that will be all your fault because you didn't want to invest that extra money. So don't let the money you've invested already go to waste, you've got to give me more money.
Just wire it through to me. Whatever way, just get it to me ASAP or we'll lose the lot.
And actually, the chap's probably panicking. He's probably handing out money left, right and centre because he doesn't want this deal to fall through, and he's getting deeper and deeper and deeper into debt. And he thinks that actually Clenshaw is his chance to salvage the situation. And of course, he's never going to salvage the situation because there is no deal and it's always going to fall flat.
Stephen Clenshaw had completely manipulated his victim into an impossible situation where he was totally at the mercy of the conman. Little did the investor know that he was ultimately putting £270,000 into Clenshaw's pocket and enabling the conman to dupe other victims.
The unfortunate victim that had provided Stephen with just over £250,000 had unknowingly and unwittingly funded Stephen's lifestyle and enabled him to develop this persona as a barrister and to carry on more cons. The repercussions for this investor, they were absolutely catastrophic. He lost his house, he lost his business, he had no idea that he was funding Clenshaw's lifestyle.
The victim, who lost £250,000 at the hands of Clenshaw, may have been the biggest loser, but he was not alone. The work of the private investigator that Mark Clive hired suggested that there were a long list of people who had been cruelly duped, including Clenshaw's employees and even his girlfriend. One by one, the police brought them in to be questioned about Stephen Clenshaw.
There was a mixed reaction from the victims. Some of them were absolutely amazed that what they'd been told wasn't true. They were completely taken in by this persona of Clenshaw as a barrister.
I went down to the police station with my mum in Sutton Coldfield and I realised that, wow, what on earth has been going on? What have I been duped into? What have I been led astray with, really? And the way I felt when I was given the work experience when I started for him, I felt so confident in myself. I felt, right, I've landed on my feet, I'm going places now. For all 4 months later to be knocked back off my perch and feel 2 feet tall and feel almost completely useless, knowing what you've done for the past 3 months renders completely null and void. I may as well have just sat on my backside and done nothing during that whole time.
Stephen Clenshaw even conned the woman who shared his home.
The young lady that he was living with, when she became fully aware of the entire picture, was devastated in the unknowing role that she played in recommending him to her friends, where he'd conducted spurious legal work on their behalf and charged them vast amounts of money for the privilege.
Devastated that she had been living a lie, Clenshaw's girlfriend immediately ended the relationship as soon as she discovered who the man she lived with really was. Like a house of cards, the lies that Clenshaw had built his con with were beginning to fall away and crash around him. But even with the police circling, Stephen Clenshaw could still make money out of any situation.
When arrested, with a smile on his face, he looked me in the eye and said, "Well, I've just won £200. I bet somebody that you were going to arrest me today."
Over a period of 14 months, conman Stephen Clenshaw had duped a cross-section of people in the Sutton Coldfield area of the Midlands. He had convinced neighbours, friends and even his ex-girlfriend and staff he hired at his firm, that he was a high-flying barrister. He conned his community out of an estimated £300,000, but his complex con came crashing down when he attempted to swindle his next-door neighbour. Stephen Clenshaw was arrested on the 29th of April 2008.
When arrested, with a smile on his face, he looked me in the eye and said, "Well, I've just won £200. I bet somebody that you were going to arrest me today." He wasn't fazed, he was completely calm, an air of nonchalance about him, very relaxed.
But a £200 bet was nothing compared to the small fortune the police discovered Clenshaw had conned and spent over a 14-month period.
Once he was in custody and we'd visited his house, we found plasma screen televisions, drum kits, games consoles, designer clothes strewn around 4 of the 5 bedrooms, still in their packaging. We believe in total Clenshaw accumulated in the region of £470,000. In excess of £250,000 was frittered away on gambling sites and his extravagant lifestyle.
But even though his crimes had been exposed, Stephen Clenshaw would not own up to them.
I interviewed Stephen 3 times between June and April in 2008. Throughout all of those interviews, he maintained he'd never told anybody that he was a barrister. He'd never signed any pieces of paper as a barrister at law or a QC. He did, however, accept that if people had formed the perception that he was a barrister, he didn't correct them.
No matter how cornered he is, how bleak it is looking for Stephen Clenshaw, still he just can't stop lying. So the victims are lining up to show that they've been duped, but he can't hold his hands up and say, "Look, I'm guilty." His need to lie is just pathological and relentless. Clearly, he wouldn't know the truth if it jumped up and bit him.
It also transpired that the con man couldn't even spell the word barrister, let alone legally practice as one.
He had signed some stuff barrister in law. Unfortunately, he'd spelt barrister wrong all the time. He couldn't spell barrister. He always missed out the second R.
But no matter how Stephen Clenshaw was spelling barrister, he would certainly need a real QC when he was placed on remand in 2008 awaiting trial. But even in prison, the conning continued.
While on remand in prison awaiting trial, Clenshaw actually told other inmates that he was an undercover journalist.
After he'd been there only a matter of a few weeks, we received a telephone call from the prison governor, who was concerned that we had unwittingly placed an undercover BBC investigative journalist into the prison system and wanted to corroborate with us that Stephen Clenshaw was a genuine criminal rather than a journalist doing an exposé.
It's interesting that even when there's no obvious gain to lying, certainly no financial gain, he just can't stop himself. So to me, I think, well, does he have some sort of identity disorder? Or is it just that he really needs to be the centre of attention?
In January 2009, Stephen Clenshaw prepared to stand trial for his crimes. But it seemed he was determined to plead not guilty to the 12 charges of dishonesty.
Throughout this investigation, and even after charge, Stephen was intent on pleading not guilty to all the charges put against him. I was as surprised as anybody else. On the morning of the Crown Court trial, having had the opportunity to discuss his position with a real defence barrister, he must have come to realise the weight of evidence against him was simply overwhelming, and he had no choice other than to plead guilty.
With Clenshaw's 11th hour change of plea, he was sentenced to 5 years in prison on the 19th of January 2009, after he callously duped almost £500,000 from his prey.
When Stephen was eventually sentenced at Crown Court to 5 years, I felt somewhat pleased for my wife. I just felt pleased that she could have some sort of closure on the fact that the crime had been committed, justice had been done, society had put him in his rightful place, and he will go away for a long period of time.
I would like to think he had some remorse. Being a human being, there's a heart in there somewhere, but gut feeling tells me no. We were just people walking cash machines for him, basically. We gave him money, and then with that money he paid for the nice cars, he paid for the fancy gadgets that he had around the house, and the whole idea of the friendship and the bonds we had were just a smokescreen to get money from us.
Whether Clenshaw will strike again when he is released remains a mystery, but the memory of the betrayal of the friendly neighbourhood conman who posed as a lawyer in order to parasitically prey on the trusting and vulnerable will no doubt outlast the bogus barrister's 5-year sentence.
Stephen Clenshaw was very calculating, very convincing, very credible, of an extremely unusual case, and one that I will not forget for a long time.
I was conned by someone who I trusted so much, who I put a lot of faith and respect into. I'm more annoyed at the fact that I lost what I thought was a very good friend, more than the fact that I've lost, in the grand scheme of things, only a few pennies compared to what he took from other people. That is just such a shame, really. But we learn lessons in life, and this was one I learnt the hard way.